A corrupt officer tried to frame me with forbidden substances to ensure I faced a huge term, but he didn't realize I was a high-level asset for the Internal Security Service. He walked right into a trap that would dismantle his organized scheme and send him behind bars for decades. I never thought my life would turn into a high-stakes thriller, but looking back, the signs were always there. My name is Marcus, and I've spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the most successful software architects in the country. I worked 80-hour weeks, skipped vacations, and poured every ounce of my soul into my company. When I finally hit it big with a government contract, I decided to treat myself to the one thing I'd dreamed of since I was a kid: a matte black Lamborghini Aventador. It wasn't just a car, it was a trophy, a physical manifestation of every obstacle I'd overcome as a black man in a world that often wanted me to stay small. I moved into a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Oak Ridge, thinking I'd finally found peace. But within the first week, I realized that my presence was a problem for some of the locals, specifically Officer Miller. Miller was a veteran on the local force, the kind of guy who walked around like he owned the sidewalk and everyone on it. The first time he pulled me over, I hadn't even reached the end of my driveway. He didn't ask for my license first. He just leaned on my window, eyes hidden behind dark aviators, and said, "A bit young to be driving something this expensive, aren't you? What's in the trunk?" I kept my hands on the steering wheel, my voice calm but firm. I showed him my credentials, my clean record, and the registration. He didn't care. He spent 40 minutes circling the car, looking for a scratch, a reason, anything to humiliate me. He finally let me go with a warning for a non-existent lane change violation, but his parting words chilled me. Cars like this don't belong in Oak Ridge. They attract the wrong kind of attention. If I were you, I'd move it before something happens to it. Over the next month, the harassment escalated. Every time I left my house, a cruiser was trailing me. Miller would sit at the end of my block, just watching. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home. I complained to the precinct, but they laughed it off, telling me Miller was just thorough. What they didn't know was that my government contract wasn't for some generic accounting software. I was working on a high-level encryption project for the intelligence community. Because of the nature of my work, I had a direct line to a specific department within the Internal Security Service. I had been told to report any unusual activity or threats to my person, as my data was considered a national security asset. I didn't want to use that card. I wanted to be a regular citizen, but Miller was making that impossible. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. I was woken up at 3 a.m. by a dull thud and the sound of shattering glass. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ran to the window. Outside, the street was bathed in a horrific dancing orange light. My Lamborghini, the car I had spent years dreaming of, was engulfed in flames. The heat was so intense I could feel it through the double-paned glass. And there, standing just at the edge of the firelight, was a figure in a dark uniform. He didn't run. He just stood there for a second, watching the carbon fiber melt into a puddle. As he turned to walk back to his patrol car, the light hit his face. It was Miller. He looked directly at my window, offered a mock salute, and drove off slowly, not even turning on his sirens. I stood there in the dark, my hands trembling, watching my dream burn to a crisp. Most people would have called 911, but I knew the police wouldn't help me. They were the ones who did this. Instead, I went to my office, opened a floor safe, and pulled out a small, encrypted satellite phone that I had never intended to use. I dialed a number that didn't exist on any public record. When a voice answered on the first ring, I didn't lead with a greeting. I just said, "The local asset has turned hostile. He just destroyed my property and threatened my safety. It's time to initiate the deep clean protocol." The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and terrifyingly calm. "Understood, Marcus." Stay inside. Don't talk to the local authorities. We are 10 minutes out." As I hung up, I realized I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the bait in a trap Miller didn't even know existed. Within minutes, the quiet street was a circus of flashing lights and the smell of acrid smoke. The fire department arrived, but there was nothing left to save. The Aventador was a hollowed-out skeleton of charred carbon fiber and melted rubber. I stood on my lawn, my arms crossed, watching the neighborhood wake up to the spectacle. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds, whispering, but I didn't care about them. My eyes were locked on the cruiser that had just pulled back onto the curb. Officer Miller stepped out, looking remarkably refreshed for a man who had just committed arson. He adjusted his belt, tipped his cap to a neighbor, and strolled over to me with a look of mock concern. "Hell of a loss, Marcus," he said, his voice dripping with insincere sympathy. "Those Italian engines, they're notorious for self-combusting. I told you this car would attract the wrong kind of attention." I didn't blink. "You did more than tell me, Miller. I saw you." The smirk on his face didn't falter. It widened. "Careful now. Accusing a police officer of a crime is a very serious matter. It might even look like you're trying to deflect. In fact," he paused, tapping his chin, "an expensive car like this, right after you move in, smells like insurance fraud to me, or maybe something even dirtier." He didn't wait for a response. He signaled to his partner, a younger guy who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "I have a sudden suspicion that this fire might be related to some illegal activity. I'm going to need to look around your garage, Marcus, for your own safety, of course." "You don't have a warrant," I said, my voice steady. "Exigent circumstances," Miller countered, stepping toward my open garage door. "I smell something suspicious. Might be an accelerant. Might be something else." I watched him go, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Miller disappeared into the garage for less than 30 seconds. When he came out, he wasn't empty-handed. He was holding a small clear bag filled with forbidden substances and a heavy, blackened, illegal weapon that looked like it had been pulled straight from a tactical locker. He held them up like trophies. "Well, look at this," Miller shouted, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Looks like our successful software guy is running a side hustle. Possession of forbidden substances with intent to distribute and an unregistered illegal weapon. That's a serious charge, Marcus. We're talking about an attempt to ruin your life with a felony that carries a huge term. Decades behind bars." He grabbed my arm, spinning me around to slap the metal cuffs onto my wrists. The cold steel bit into my skin. But I didn't resist. I just looked at the digital clock on my phone, which was still in my pocket. 9 minutes had passed since my call. "You're making a mistake," I whispered as he shoved me toward his cruiser. "The only mistake was you moving into my town," Miller hissed in my ear. But just as he reached for the car door, the sound of the fire engines was drowned out by the low synchronized roar of heavy engines. 3 blacked-out SUVs swerved onto the street, moving with a precision that no local police department possessed. They didn't use sirens. They didn't use bullhorns. They simply boxed in Miller's cruiser, cutting him off from the exit. Doors flew open in unison. 6 men in tactical gear, carrying high-end equipment and wearing windbreakers labeled with the insignia of the Internal Security Service, stepped out. They didn't look at the fire. They didn't look at the neighbors. They moved directly toward us. Miller's face went pale. He fumbled for his holster, but the lead agent, a tall woman with a gaze like flint, already had her badge out. "Officer Miller, step away from the civilian. Now." "This is a local matter," Miller stammered, his bravado evaporating. "I just found forbidden substances and an illegal weapon in his house. He's a criminal." The lead agent didn't even look at the evidence in Miller's hand. She looked at me and nodded almost imperceptibly. Then she turned back to Miller. "We aren't here for the civilian. We've been monitoring your radio and your personal communications for 6 months, officer. We know about the organized scheme you've been running with the local precinct. She signaled to her team. 2 agents moved to Miller's patrol car, while another began to unlock my handcuffs. Miller was trembling now, his eyes darting around for an escape. But then one of the agents at his car shouted, "Ma'am, you need to see this." He pulled a hidden compartment open in Miller's dashboard, revealing not just more forbidden substances, but an encrypted laptop and a list of names. The lead agent scanned the list, and for the first time, her professional mask slipped into a look of genuine shock. She looked at me, then back at the list, then at Miller. "This isn't just a local graft," she whispered. "Marcus, your name isn't the only one on here. Your entire security clearance, it's been sold, and the buyer is already on their way to this address." The air turned ice cold as a nondescript gray sedan pulled into the cul-de-sac, moving slowly past the smoking wreckage of my car. It stopped right behind the black SUVs. 2 men in sharp, expensive suits stepped out, looking more like corporate executives than criminals. But the way they scanned the scene, the cold, calculating way they assessed the tactical team, told me they weren't here for a business meeting. They were the radicals the Internal Security Service had been tracking, the ones Miller had been feeding high-level data from my projects as part of his organized scheme. Agent Vance didn't hesitate. She signaled her team, and before the men from the sedan could even reach for their coats, they were surrounded. "Down on the ground, now!" the agents barked. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One of the men tried to reach into his waistband for what I assumed was an illegal weapon, but he was tackled into the pavement before his hand even cleared his hip. Within seconds, the buyers were in zip ties, their faces pressed against the asphalt right next to the charred remains of my Lamborghini. Miller was trembling so hard his teeth were literally chattering. The arrogance he'd carried just minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew his life as he knew it was over. Agent Vance walked over to him, her boots crunching on the glass from my car's headlights. She held up the encrypted laptop her team had pulled from his cruiser. "You were selling the security clearances of government contractors to high-level radicals," she said, her voice like a jagged blade. "This isn't just a case of arson or police corruption, Miller. This is a massive breach of national security. You've been part of an organized scheme that we've been dismantling piece by piece for months. We just needed the final link. You were arrogant enough to give it to us because you couldn't stand the sight of a successful black man in your neighborhood." "I didn't know," Miller screamed, his voice cracking. "I just thought it was some data. I didn't know who they were." "Ignorance isn't a defense for a felony of this magnitude," Vance replied coldly. "You're facing a massive term. We're talking decades behind bars, Miller, in a facility where your former badge won't provide you an ounce of protection." She turned to her team. "Take him, and get the local chief of police on the line. I want his entire precinct locked down for a full internal audit by the morning. If anyone else is touched by this organized scheme, they go down tonight." As they dragged Miller away, he looked at me one last time. There was no smirk, no salute, just the hollow eyes of a man who realized he had set fire to his own life the moment he lit that match. I stood there watching the man who tried to break me being shoved into the back of a black SUV, the very place he had intended for me. Agent Vance walked over to me as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a long shadow across the ruins of my driveway. She handed me a business card. "I'm sorry it came to this, Marcus. We had to wait for the handoff to happen to catch the buyers. Your car. I know it meant a lot to you." I looked at the blackened frame of the Aventador. "It was just a car," I said, though my voice was heavy. "But the message he was trying to send? That's what mattered. He thought he could take everything I worked for because of the way I look." "He thought wrong," Vance said firmly. "The department is already processing a full reimbursement for your property and your emotional distress. It'll be settled by the end of the week. And as for your security clearance, it's been elevated. You're one of our top assets, Marcus. No one is going to touch you again. A few months later, I was back in Oak Ridge. I didn't move. I refused to let Miller's hate push me out of the home I'd earned. The local precinct had been purged, with half the officers fired or under indictment for their roles in the organized scheme. The new chief was a professional who made it clear that the old ways were dead and buried. I pulled into my driveway in a brand-new Lamborghini, matte black, just like the old one, but even faster. As I stepped out, a neighbor who used to look the other way when Miller harassed me gave me a polite nod. I didn't nod back. I didn't need their approval. I had my life back. My reputation was spotless, and the man who tried to destroy me was staring at the walls of a cell, realizing too late that some people are much, much more than they appear to be. Justice didn't just find Miller. It burned his world down, just like he did to mine.